Okay, in this video, I want to go over a few subsurface scattering settings for assignment 9 for the rendering and shading class. There are different setups I would recommend depending on which plant you choose and I guess how you approach it in uh, Substance Painter. So in this example, I have the Monstera plant plugged in and I have a shader attached to it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what this looks like by scratch. So we're going to go ahead and take this material, or this object, sorry, and I'll get rid of the non-planty stuff. I'll assign a new material. Just going to go ahead and get a Pixar surface. Okay, let's go ahead and start a new render. All right, so first thing we're going to have to do is we are going to have to decide on what we're going to be using for our plant material. If we're going to be using either A, subsurface slash single scatter, or B, if we want to use the thin double-sided material. This is really pretty much just based on what your object is made of. So in this case, this object has two sides to it, right? So these objects have a back and a front, right? It has thickness and a dimension to it. If I come back over to see this one, so let's go ahead and show this one and hide this one. These objects do not have thickness to them. They are single-sided, okay? So it's just a different type of object, and the subsurface, as I have come to understand it, does not behave the way that you would expect on an object that is thin, that doesn't have any thickness to it. So I'll talk about this one in a second, but let's take a look at as if we were doing a plant with some thickness to it. Okay, so if you're doing a plant that has some thickness to it, let's come over to our Pixar surface material. Hopefully you'll remember the Pixar surface setup video that I have, like just the shader settings. If I'm going to be doing subsurface scattering, what I need to do is let's go ahead and pull this back up. Turn off my diffuse. So we'll go up to here. So this is if I'm using subsurface scattering. So this is probably the heaviest one, but it's also the most physically accurate one in terms of shading settings for getting that scattering effect of light traveling through it. Because just as a recap, the light is behind the object, but these are solid. The light's not coming through it. And we want to get that effect, that leafy light transparency effect that a much organic material has. So I'll make sure my diffuse is turned off. I still want some specular, of course, so I'm going to set this somewhere like 0.023 or 5. Bring that edge color up, maybe bring up a little roughness. Of course, I'd have maps if I was doing this from Substance Painter, but in my case, I'm not really worrying about that right now. And so to enable my subsurface scattering, I'll come down here to subsurface. I just use the default Jensen dipole. You can use whichever one you want to use. There's different models. And we'll go ahead and turn the gain up to 1. So you can already see light is hitting the back and spreading into those shadow areas behind it. But of course, this doesn't look quite right. First, our surface color isn't right. And also, you can see it's actually picking up like a warm color, which is this MFP color right here, mean free path color. So if I set it to red, right, we're getting like a red tint coming through when it goes through. So this is just affecting the color that goes into the material. So in my case, let's go ahead and set that back to its default for a second. So for the surface color, that's just going to be like your diffuse map or your albedo base color map, whatever you want to call it. So in my case, I just chose like a dark green. Already that's looking pretty good, right? So I just have like a warm tint. So it's picking up like a warm tint as it goes through, which may or may not be what you want. It depends on your observations. You have to kind of also take into account when you look at your references, if you see like warm colors coming through, that might also be a factor of the sun. That might not necessarily be the color that's being picked up from beneath. But, in this case, I just went with like some kind of like more saturated light green color, still on the warm end. And there you go. So that's pretty much the subsurface scattering settings. Well, okay, that's only half of it. So let's take a look at a few of the other settings that are really important. So that's the color. That's how we just get it working. Now we need to take into account how deep we want the light to travel through the object. Let me go ahead and I'm going to do a snapshot of that just so I have a version of this, and I'll move this one down. Okay. All right, so here, this mean free path distance is how far light travels through our object. So if I have it at 10, that's pretty much maxed out. I mean, you can go higher than 10. But this number is sort of arbitrary because what it's really based on is the size of your object compared to the unit length, or essentially the scale settings inside of Maya. So in Maya, you know, when you set up your scene, you can go in and you can set the Maya scene unit size, whether that's centimeters or inches or millimeters. I'm not going to go over that in here. I recommend if you guys are doing this with certain materials like skin, it's a good idea to try to get it physically accurate. So setting up your scene scale correctly, scaling your object correctly, and then using the right subsurface settings. In my case, I'm going to kind of eyeball it, but I just do want to point these out. So, you know, I would set up my scene scale. I would use my measuring tools, right? Which I think it's under create measuring tools. It's there it is, measuring tools. So you can get the size of your object. And then, you know, if it's, let's say it's in inches, I would try to scale this so it's like, I don't actually know how many inches this would be. This would be, let's say it's going to be like 2 feet, right? So I would get this to be 24 Maya units tall. I think that's how it works. It's been a while since I've done that. But then what we'd also want to do is we'd want to then have to say, okay, our Maya units are in centimeters, right? I went ahead and scaled this up to 24 centimeters. I changed it, but let's just say that's what it was. Then what I would do is when I come into subsurface, I would go under advanced, or trace control. Oh, sorry. Scattering globals. Sorry, scattering globals, and we have unit length right here. And when you hover over it, it says right there, this is unit length. If the scene is modeled in some other scale, so by default it's in millimeters. So this is assuming that the scene and the models are measured by millimeters. So if you wanted to change it to centimeters, you had to change this number, et cetera, et cetera. So you'd have to do some kind of conversion if you want to do that. If you're not really worrying about the exact number scale of your object, in this case, I'm not really going to worry about it too much, then I'm just really going to be worrying about this distance. So it's essentially going to be this scattering global is like you setting the size of your, like what measurement units your scene is in. And this right here is a multiplier on top of how deep light's allowed to travel. So right now it's at 10, which is the default max. Like I said, you can go higher than this. It's not limited to 10. But you'll see when I go down to 0, it's on the opposite end. It has like no light's not able to travel anywhere. It goes in the surface and immediately stops, right? So, you know, somewhere in between these is where we want this to be. And so this is where you're going to want to look at your references, see how deep light actually scatters. In my case, when I was doing this earlier, I kind of kept it around 1, right? Sometimes 10 feels good, but in reality, 10 can be kind of a problem because, you know, it starts to wash out and then all the shading gets a little funky. So you have to be careful. It's only certain materials you don't want it to be at. So in my case, I think I'm just going to go with 10. And I think that looks pretty cool. Some other things I want to look into is with this model. If your model doesn't have this issue, you don't have to worry about this, or if it's a different type of model. But in this case, what we have is we have an object penetrating another object, which sometimes can confuse or make the certain effects look weird. So subsurface scattering is one of those effects, and you'll see where those veins are, it gets a little dark. Okay, there's a more advanced setup you can do where you're setting, what is it called? I think it's tracing subsets, where you're essentially like grouping objects together for RenderMan to say, hey, treat these objects as like an object together and not that they're interfering with one another. But what we can do here that's a little bit more simple is going under trace control. And right here for this right here, and this is where that trace subset would be if you wanted to define those groups, continuation ray mode. And so if you change this to last hit or all hits, I usually do last hit in this case. What it does is it doesn't, like light is going and hitting multiple barriers, which is essentially like darkening the value or having it extinguish faster. So if I did it as a last hit, it's going to go all the way through both models until it exits out a model and doesn't hit another one. Then it kind of calculates that subsurface. So in this case, you know, those veins now have much less of an impact on that, right? And you can still see it. It's a thicker object, the veins are, so it is blocking light a little bit more. But now we're not getting that weird black shading. You can also play around with all hits, which is it's going to calculate all of the hits. And it's somewhere in between, or in this very specific scenario, it's going to have a similar effect somewhere between the no hits and the last hit. So essentially this is just controlling, you know, where it stops and starts and takes the calculations for the calculating the subsurface scattering trace values. That's pretty much it for the subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is going to be the most accurate looking of these effects. But in order to do that, we really just need to turn off our diffuse, right? Diffuse is off. Don't worry about specular. And we just turn this subsurface on. And we're going to go ahead and set a color, mean free path distance, and the color that light is being absorbed as it travels through the object. And if you have something like objects that are intersecting with each other and you're getting weird black shading artifacts, try changing the continuation rule ray mode. Okay, so next up we're going to take a look at something similar to Subsurface, and that is the single scatter. Okay, so for the single scatter, it's a very similar setup. Well, actually, it's not really, but it's a very similar effect. This just has a simpler calculation. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my subsurface scattering. And the single scattering can be found. So let's go ahead and turn off the trace control down here under single scatter. Okay, so single scatter is going to be if you want to get like light penetration through the object effect, this is a simpler and cheaper calculation. So in my case, since these are going to be hero plants, I'm probably going to use subsurface scattering in this case because I want a more realistic like beauty render. If these are like background objects, or I had like a ton of these objects and subsurface might be too expensive, then maybe single scatter might be what I use. So you'll see right away, I'm going to turn it on. It doesn't behave quite like subsurface scattering does, right? So it doesn't now have a surface color and then the mean free path color. And that's because this one is actually going to be used in conjunction with diffuse. So this is essentially taking the diffuse, like a normal diffuse shading, and then adding on a scattering effect on top of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn on the gain for my diffuse. I'm going to go ahead and grab that surface color from my diffuse. Okay, and then now I'm going to come down here for my scattering effects. And so it's going to be very similar for, the subsurface, right? I'll set that to kind of like my surface color. And for this one, I'm going to set that to that scattering color. And we can bring this down a little bit lower, but you'll see it's not quite as strong of a, let's go ahead and delete that one. Let's see. I think it was this one. Let's go ahead and drag this one down. All right, so it's not quite as strong of an effect, obviously. And so depending on the thickness of your object and the intensity of the light source behind it, you're going to have to kind of like artistically drive this a little bit. So directionality is going to be if, like, let's say the light is coming from the back of the model. And essentially, you think about light traveling through these leaves. Let's say there's a light right here pointing this way. Is the light hitting the front of the polygon or the back of the polygon? And this directionality is going to be favoring one or the other. In our case, we probably aren't going to worry about that too much. I think just leaving it 0, so it equally treats it both ways, is probably a good choice. But in certain situations, you might want to change that. Fractive index is just going to be scattering of the light itself when it goes through. Blur is going to blur like a texture. So if you have like a word, let me go ahead and bring up something really quickly. Here we go. So you can see I highly encourage you guys to look up the settings for these, but you can see down here, so here's where that directionality is, right? They're favoring one direction or another. Fractive index is scattering that light as it travels through, and then blur is if you have a texture. So in this case, they have a texture on the backside, so light's transmitting through, but this texture has the word transmission written on it. So when the blur is low, that image comes in perfectly, and when it's high, it blurs it out. So in our case, we're probably not going to have to worry about it too much, but that's just something that you have to be aware of. Okay, let's go back into RenderMan. All right, so what we want to do though to get that light coming through stronger is increasing our backside direct gain. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up a bit. And I think earlier through some of my testing, I was doing something like 0.2, and then I was also tinting this similar to how I was tinting that mean free path color. So you can see it's similar-ish, right? It's not quite as like pleasing to look at. It's not quite as realistic in terms of how it's calculating light, but you can get a very similar effect if you play around with this. And in some cases, the single scatter can give you a little bit more artistic control as well. And then of course we have that trace control in here as well. So if I wanted to set that to, let's do the last hit. So we can kind of hopefully fix some of those darker lines in the object. And maybe I'll come in here and I'll just bring that direct backside gain up a little bit. Okay, so similar-ish, just different. And like I said, subsurface scattering is going to have like a nicer effect. It's going to feel a little bit more realistic. But, single scatter is there. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and show you guys the thin plant, and then, or the thin leaves, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it up by showing you guys plugging in textures from Substance Painter into RenderMan for Subsurface Scattering. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to hide this one and show this one. Okay, so now I have this object right here, and I'm going to go ahead and do this one again by, let's go ahead and let's do here, grab all these guys, I'll assign a new material, and we'll go to, and see, Pixar surface, okay. So for this material, I have leaves, like I said before, that they have no back to them, right? So these objects are single-sided. So what I'm going to do is I am going to come here to, essentially I have that light coming from behind, so I just rotated my light so it's coming from behind. So let's go here, right? So I just chose like an arbitrary one that I liked, which was 188, to get that effect and see it a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my material. So we'll go ahead and select my leaf, come here. All right, so for this one, I'll go ahead and just show you what that looks like. I'll go ahead and turn on the single scatter or the subsurface. Let's try subsurface. And the effect is a little weird, right? It doesn't quite behave the way that we expect it to. I'll go ahead and set those colors so we can maybe get it to act a little bit better. But you can see like the shading on the back's kind of strange. We could try doing double-sided and that kind of works, but it doesn't quite have the settings we want. We can do the transmit gain right here. So that is one way you can do it if you wanted to have like a subsurfacey, or use the subsurface shading model to do this and use that transmit gain, but just with double-sided on. Because this object, we want to tell it to, hey, treat this and shade it on both sides of the polygon, not just on one side of the polygon, which was causing those black shadows. So I'm going to come in here, but we can also do that up here in the, if you do this, just be aware, if you're playing around with these, that sometimes the scattering effects from, even though you turn the gain off of it, like for instance on this one right here, if I turn that backside gain on, you can see it's actually affecting the object even though the single scatter is turned off. So you have to be aware of that, is that those settings that you have changed in the either this, like in these advanced, it's usually in these advanced menus, is going to have an effect on it. There we go. All right, so I'll come back up here and I'll go ahead and turn on my diffuse. So I can just use this with diffuse. And up here in diffuse, we have that same kind of setting. We have that transmission, and we can set that transmission color. Ooh, too much. And we can just bring it down. We get out of that back and forth. And you can see it's pretty similar. I just probably would just have to change the, on the double-sided down here, I would just have to change the, oh, okay, so this one, it's using the mean free path color, I'm guessing, and then just that transmission gain for the distance. So I don't turn on both of these because it's just going to double up. So this one right here is going to be like that mean free path color if you're using the diffuse. So that would be pretty simple. This is how we're using the double-sided diffuse transmission effect. So if we have a thin object, we would just want to make sure we enable that double-sided, whether it's under diffuse or you are doing this under subsurface scattering, right? And you're coming down to subsurface and then doing double-sided. I don't think, oh, I guess, okay, single scatter has the same setting in there, but I would just kind of keep it simple. So that's how we can do the 3 different setups. So we have the subsurface. Let's see, we'll do this. I'll go ahead and collapse these down. Here we go. So we have, if we have a thin single-sided object, we can do diffuse with advanced double-sided turned on. And then we can use that transmission gain, turn it up, and set a color for the scattering color. And that's how we can do it if we have an object that is single-sided. I'm going to turn that back off. Okay. If we wanted if we have an object with thickness to it, I mean, we could still use subsurface on this object, but usually when we have an object that has thickness to it, we're going to use either subsurface or single scatter, right? Subsurface, we want to do that. Let's just go ahead and hide this again and show the Monstera. Okay. So for the Monstera, let's select the leaf. So we would just, in this case, I have the single scatter. So right now I'm using single scatter. Let me just fix this. Sorry, this is a little messy. Okay, let's turn there we go. direct backside turned off. All right, so then on this I would just use my subsurface scattering, right? So I'll just turn my diffuse off, make sure everything else is turned off, more or less in terms of the single scatter and anything else. And then I'll just set the color, distance that the light travels through it, and then the color of the light traveling through it. And then in the trace control, just changing the continuation ray mode if I need to, if I'm getting weird shading artifacts from models intersecting from each other. And then we have the single scatter, which is very similar to the subsurface scattering. But what we usually want to do is we want to combine, I mean, I guess you could technically combine with subsurface, but at that point you might as well just use subsurface. So I'll turn on the diffuse color, or diffuse gain, so that I'm using diffuse shading, and then I'll come down to single scatter. Oh, it was already on. We'll make sure it's turned on. And then using that backside direct gain if we want to enhance that depth of, or that how deep that light travels through. It's essentially like multiplying the light hitting the backside of it so that the light goes through more brightly, which is in effect kind of causing the same effect as the subsurface with like a deeper scatter depth to it. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you guys really quickly the setting up the textures. So I'm going to come out here to Substance Painter. So in Substance Painter, I have this material right here, or this object right here. It's kind of a silly one, but all I essentially did was just I made this like really quick leaf. I just grabbed a procedural, dropped it on there, and then what I did was I made sure that my material, so if I come over to texture set settings, I have all my material attribute channels here. I would want to make sure my material has the scattering attribute to it. If it doesn't, then I can just add here and just try to find scattering and make it add it. If that scattering isn't here in this list, then what I need to do is I need to make sure I'm using a shader that will let me use that. So I come over to my shader settings. I'm using the Adobe Standard material. Any of the Adobe Standard materials are great. I would use those. And so just if you can use those, that would be good. Some of them don't have scattering to them, so you just have to be aware of it. In order to enable subsurface scattering, and this is only just for viewing it inside Substance Painter. I'm just doing this because I want to see the subsurface scattering inside Substance Painter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my shader, make sure subsurface scattering is set to enable. We'll come here to the scattering value in a second. You can change to a different type of essentially subsurface calculation scatterer. In this case, I'm just leaving it to the default one. I'm not worrying about it too much inside of Substance Painter because there's only a few things that we're going to pull out of this. And I'm also going to have to make sure under my display settings that subsurface scattering is also turned on here. Okay, so I did that in my texture set settings, in my display settings, and in my shader settings. I made sure subsurface scattering is enabled and that I had added a scattering setting. There's also a scattering color. So you can do scattering color here. And that would be really useful if you were doing something that you really wanted to control the color of the light that's traveling underneath it, and not just make it a constant color. But for our purposes for this assignment, let's just make it a constant color. It's going to be so much easier. And it's like really diminishing returns. Okay, so I'll come out here. So my object, I have my leaf material, and then what I did was I added this scattering material. Let's go ahead and look at this 3D only. And I'm gonna look at this more from the front. So when you're doing it in this like preview window, viewport kind of setting, I'll turn this on and off, right? So you can see that it's, you know, like the shadows from any objects that are casting shadows, like bump, it can be the bump or height information, but it could also be objects casting light on other objects or blocking. If I turn on and off this material, you can see how much those shadows are disappearing. And that's just that scattering setting. So I just created this fill layer, set the scattering color to white, right? Which is just essentially going to make it max out. And this is just the scattering value. So it's essentially a grayscale value. I think so. And then when I come over here to the shader settings, if I change that scale, that's going to affect how deep light penetrates through the object, right? On this type of object, it's kind of hard to see a little bit until we start doing a iRay view. So we'll just set that to here for now. And what I did also was, you know, if you're just going to be doing this scattering, like the whole thing uniform, just filling everything with the exact same scattering value, that's fine for preview purposes, but that's not a texture map you're going to want to take out. So, you know, just keep that in mind. In my case, what I'm going to do is I wanted certain areas to scatter deeper than others. So we can take a look at this mask I created. You can see that along the edges, I wanted to scatter the most. And then I also wanted these stalks, these stems, veins, whatever you want to call them, to block more scattering. So there's less scattering. And there's areas I can clean up, but I did this really fast. But you can see here, I just wanted this to block where it's darker, it has less scattering effect, and where it's lighter, it has more scattering effect. Okay, and Substance Painter, this is kind of hard to see the effect. It's not like super noticeable. I could probably just hide all those, but actually, yeah. Okay, so if you want to see it actually, so this is really, it does, in the viewport, it does a good job of showing you the softening of hard details. So bumps and crevices and cracks and scratches and all that stuff, you know, they're kind of blurring out. But it doesn't do a good job of showing you the light going through the entire model, right? So you can see I turn the light up behind it. I'm still using the panorama HDR, but I don't really see the light coming through. So in order to do that, you're going to have to use the eye ray. So if I turn on the rendering eye ray, here we go. So you can actually start to see that light penetrating through the object, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring it behind. I might even kind of angle it a little bit better, like right here. And then now what I can do is I'll come over here to into the shader settings and to come to the subsurface. And then if I increase that scattering distance, it's going to control how deep the light penetrates through the object. Theoretically, it should. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So when it's at 0, you can see it's, as I'm increasing, it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay. So anyways, so that's just so if I can test this in Substance Painter without bringing it into RenderMan right away, and just see if that effect is happening. Okay. I'm going to turn off that eye ray. And so I want to export this texture map, right, where I can have deeper, less and more light penetration. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is what I'm going to use this as a mask. So there's not like a scattering value in Substance Painter. There's a lot of, RenderMan, there's a lot of different shader attributes, and they're not one-to-one to Substance Painter. Really, I just want to use a scattering depth mask. It's essentially going to control, is it going to have more scattering or less scattering? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to export my textures. And what I need to do is I'm going to use a RenderMan Pixar surface, right? But the problem is if I come over here and look at what Pixar surface has, it doesn't have any scattering stuff. You can see the scattering attribute input is not being plugged into any export texture maps, right? So if I exported this, I'm not going to get that scattering texture attribute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this and duplicate that template. I'm going to name this, so we'll just say Pixar surface underscore SSS. Okay. And on this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a new output. So it's going to create a new texture map. I'll just create it with grayscale. And then I'm going to go ahead and drag the scattering and attach it to this new texture map. So it's going to essentially export a new texture map, and it's going to use that scattering attribute in Substance Painter. Grab the gray channel, and I'm just going to copy one of these names, paste it here, so it has proper naming when it exports. And I'm just going to replace whatever this displacement or presence or glow color, whatever you copied. I'm going to type in, let's say, scatter mask. Okay, doesn't really matter what you call it, as long as you know what it is. Okay, so now I'll come in here and I want to go ahead and find that Pixar surface. Let's see, I don't know why I called it that, but let's see, Pixar surface SSS, there we go. Choose my export location, and I'll go ahead and export. Okay, and you'll see it's exporting a scatter mask, which is great. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over into Maya. Let's see, we have our Monstera leaf. Okay, and then I'm going to come over here. And so what I did here is, so if we take a look at our, let's go ahead and let me not do this full screen. Bad idea. Let's pull this over. Okay, so, and let's pull that up. There we go. All right, so if I come over to this Monstera leaf, right, I'm using Subsurface Scattering right now, I hope. Let's go ahead and turn off, make sure these guys are turned off. Direct backside gain's turned off, and single scatter. Okay, and my Subsurface Scattering's turned on. Cool. So I'm using a mean free path distance of 1. In my case, I probably don't even need to use this quote-unquote advanced setup I'm about to use. But if you're going to use a value more than 1, we can't really plug in that scattering map because that scattering map just goes from 0 to 1. There's no values that can go past it. So I'm going to use it actually more like a mask because I want to get values. Let's say I wanted subsurface that went from, I don't know, like 2 to 5, right? I can't really plug a texture map in for that unless I had set it up in Subsurface to have values of going up to values of 5. So in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to use a blend node. And so a blend node is just a way of, compositing two values or two images together. Usually using two images, but you can just use values. So what I can do here is I just created this Pixar blend node, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in a black and white mask here. So the black and white mask is going to be here. Wherever it's black, it's going to show this bottom color, and wherever it's white on that mask, it's going to show the top color. And so I'm just going to set the top color and bottom color to be my subsurface scattering mean free path distance value. So that value right here. Let's hide everything else just so this is easier to look at. So this depth control value right here. So I'm going to go ahead and come here. I want it to wherever the deepest penetration I want for the light. Let's just go ahead and set it higher. Let's go ahead and do like 2, just to show. And then the minimal I want on it is, I don't want to go 0 because it's going to be like a hard stone-like object, or like a wood or something like that, or plastic, or really thick plastic, I guess. Something that's not very like translucent. So I still want it to be semi-translucent. So for that bottom color, I'm going to go ahead and set this to, let's say, 0.5. And it's a good idea to test these out. Something you're going to want to make sure is you want to disable clamp output, because this top color is 2. It's actually a clamp to 1. So I want to turn that off, because otherwise it's not going to let me use values outside of 0 to 1. Okay. So, in the thicker areas where I want less subsurface scattering, it's going to be 0.5. The mean free path distance depth, right here. And then where it's white and that texture map that scatter mask I created, I want it to be deeper, so 2. Okay, and now I'm just I loaded in that texture map, right? My scatter mask right here, scatter mask. And I'm going to plug that, one of the color channels to the top alpha. So that's going to be plugged in right here. And then I'm going to plug in the results, one of the color channels, to the subsurface DMFP. So remember that distance mean free path. Don't ask me why it's called that, or why they say distance mean free path instead of mean free path distance. But that should be what we need to do. If we did that scattering color, right, where let's say we didn't want to just be constant green underneath the surface, we wanted to have like reds and blues for some reason, then you would plug that texture map into the mean free path color. Okay, so I plugged that in, and let's go ahead and take a look at this. We're not going to notice a very big difference because I'm not really using like drastically different values for this type of object. But let's go ahead and take a look at the masks plugged in. Let's go here, and I'm probably not using the right objects. Let's go ahead and, or I don't have the right shader attached. So I'm just going to go ahead and reassign that Monstera one because we just created a new one instead. So Monstera leaf, there we go. All right, so apparently it didn't calculate that image, so let's go ahead and let it do that really quickly. Okay, and so there's that mask right there. Here is, we can't see the values really because they're essentially clamped, but you can see when I hover over this, you can see those values are going between 1 and 2, right? Where along the edges it should be higher, right? You see it's getting higher, like 1.8, 1.9. If I go to that stock where it's lower, it's going to be 1.4, right? So that's kind of like that's good. That's what that looks like our mask, right? Where it's darker here and brighter here. And I just plugged that into here and into this texture map here. This blend node, and then we're taking that blend node with those values and we're plugging them into the mean free path distance. So if you have a texture map where you want to control how deep light penetrates in certain areas, so it penetrates deeper in some areas and less in some area, and in other areas, then you could use essentially export that scattering channel or texture map as a mask, and then plug it in using this Pixar blend node. So hopefully that helps. If you guys have any questions or if that was confusing, please let us know in Slack, and I can try to help you guys figure out whatever setup you're trying to work with.